Welcome back. We're in the middle of our discussion of the amendments to the Constitution. You hear a lot about the original intent and the framers, but just think for a moment about how significant the amendments are to your life, to our collective life. Think about the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, free exercise of religion, right to counsel, and so on. Those rights are parts of the amendments to the Constitution, not the original document. And you might say, well, they're still part of that founding moment, that founding era. True enough, although even then, note that the very phrase, Bill of Rights, was not the phrase that appears in the document itself or that was common at the founding period, at least in official references to these early amendments in places like Supreme Court cases. The Supreme Court doesn't start referring to these early amendments as the Bill of Rights until after the Civil War and because of the Civil War. Because during the Civil War and the amendments, the next generation of amendments, people talked a lot about the Bill of Rights and described the early amendments as a Bill of Rights. And way more important than merely describing them as a Bill of Rights, the framers of the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War, a much later generation of Americans, insisted that that Bill of Rights apply against state and local governments, what lawyers and judges call incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states. Remember, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech and free press. But what happens when states try to shut down free political discourse about, for example, slavery? That's not a hypothetical. That actually happened in America in the antebellum period. States tried to shut down political discussion, made it a crime to be anti-slavery, a member of the Republican Party, put preachers in the pulpit, in prison, for preaching against slavery. So not just free speech and free press, but free exercise was threatened by this regime. When you think today about the most important Bill of Rights cases that come to your mind, I suspect you're actually, strictly speaking, not thinking about the original Bill of Rights. You're probably thinking about cases involving state and local governments. You're thinking about New York Times versus Sullivan, or Miranda versus Arizona, or Lawrence versus Texas, Griswold versus Connecticut. None of those, strictly speaking, is a Bill of Rights case. Every one of those is a 14th Amendment case, a case in which a state was claimed to have abridged a fundamental freedom of Americans, a state or locality. Now, from the beginning, at the founding, James Madison actually worried that states would misbehave when he actually proposed a Bill of Rights or early amendments to the Constitution in the first Congress. He had an amendment that said no state shall, but he didn't get the votes for it because in the wake of the American Revolution, with a lot of states' rights, anti-federalist sentiment, very powerful at that time, a lot of Americans were fearful of the central government and thought they could trust state governments. Remember, the American Revolution was fought by local governments against an imperial center, and the Bill of Rights reflects that American revolutionary anti-federalist states' rights sentiment. Remember, it begins, Congress shall make no law, and it ends with the 10th Amendment reaffirming the idea of enumerated powers of the federal government and reserved powers of the states. So the original Bill of Rights, anti-federalist to some extent, protecting rights only against the federal government. Madison wanted more, but he couldn't get it at the founding. But the Reconstruction generation did get it. John Bingham, the main draftsperson of the key section of the 14th Amendment, was able to accomplish in the 1860s what James Madison, an earlier congressperson, was unable to accomplish in the 1790s. So the amendments loom so large for us. If you think the Bill of Rights is important, then I suspect that what you really think is important is how the Bill of Rights has come to apply against the states. Because, in fact, before the Civil War, even though these early amendments were on the books, they weren't vigorously enforced by courts. Congress passes a sedition law, and courts make it a crime to criticize the federal government. It says Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, Congress made freedom of the press. Congress made such a law, and courts enforced it. Supreme Court justices put men in prison for criticizing the government. And they so the Bill of Rights didn't mean so much on the ground until the only Bill of Rights case that the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court before the Civil War enforces the Bill of Rights against the federal government, is the preposterous ruling in Dred Scott in 1857 that when Congress prohibits slavery in the territories, when it basically says, don't bring your slaves here. If you do, you'll lose them. Keep them out of the territories. You can keep them where they are, but don't bring them into these territories. These territories are free soil. Dred Scott said that law violated the Bill of Rights. That law was unconstitutional. Why? Because it violated, it was a deprivation of property without due process of law, said the Taney Court. But that's preposterous, because the law was passed by Congress and enforced by judges and juries. That is due process of law. That's fair procedure. But the Fifth Amendment says, and the Fifth Amendment surely says due process, and it says the federal government can't violate due process. That phrase comes from England. And England has always had the rule that you can't bring slaves onto English soil, that if you do, you'd forfeit them. That's the land of due process. Due process was always understood as consistent with prohibiting slavery. But that's the only enforcement of the Bill of Rights against Congress in the antebellum period, the pre-Civil War period. The Bill of Rights today means a lot. It's in a part of every American's daily life and part of your consciousness because of cases, basically, much later cases, applying the Bill of Rights against state and local governments. And that's because of the 14th Amendment. A later generation, or put differently, today we believe passionately in equality, equality of persons, of black and white, male and female, Jew and Gentile. The Framers' Constitution did not emphatically embed that equality idea. The Declaration of Independence had lofty language, drafted by a slaveholder, interpreted differently by different people, but not quite binding law. The 14th Amendment puts that word equal in the Constitution in connection with individual equality, equality of all persons. The original Constitution talked about equality of states voting in the Senate. Each state gets an equal number of votes, namely 2 in the Senate, but had nothing about equality of persons. That's a 14th Amendment textual commitment, not a founding era textual commitment. It's all about the amendments. Look who's president today. Barack Obama. Barack Obama doesn't get elected president under the founders' rules, which were pro-slavery in some very important ways, advantaged the slaveholding South, had no guarantee whatsoever that people would be allowed to vote equally regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Framers said nothing about equality of voting rights regardless of race. The Reconstruction generation, the amenders, added that 15th Amendment. Without that amendment, I think it's just unimaginable that someone like Barack Obama could be president. There's something like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we'll talk about in later lectures, could ever pass. So George Washington is absolutely central to our constitutional vision. We'll talk a lot about Washington's particular constitutional vision in later lectures. In fact, there will be 2 lectures devoted just to Washington's vision, and he's on the $1 bill, and rightly so. He embodies national security and geostrategy, and he is pro-slavery, although in that he's a slaveholder and he dies a slaveholder, but he, at the end of his life, is trying to move away from slavery, and that is one of many, many things to be said in favor of the greatness of George Washington. But Washington will give way to Jackson, another general who can beat the British, embodying national security, but now in a much more aggressively pro-slavery way. Washington wanted to end slavery at the end of his life. Jackson never said anything like that. much more pro-slavery, puts Roger Taney on the court. And Jackson is the most important figure in antebellum America, and he's going to give way eventually, and that system fails, to Abe Lincoln. So you got the $1 bill, George Washington, you got the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, but the $5 bill, Abe Lincoln, we today live way more in Lincoln's house than in either Washington or Jackson's, or Thomas Jefferson's, James Madison's for that matter. We live in a house that was divided against itself because of slavery, that fell because of slavery, call that the Civil War, that got rebuilt, that house, reconstructed, if you will, by Abraham Lincoln's generation. So we live, I would argue, far more in Lincoln's Constitution than we have understood. That's the generation that rebuilt the Bill of Rights, in effect, and applied it against the states and promised equality, civil equality for all, racial equality, even in the franchise. That's the modern world that we live in, and it's a world of the amenders. So founding fathers, yes, we spent a lot of time talking about their vision. That's what all the early lectures were about, their vision. But I don't want you to forget that our Constitution is an intergenerational project, and you have to take seriously the amendments as well as the original founding vision. Now, in that spirit, in the remainder of this lecture and in the next one, I'm going to talk about the next great wave of amendments. We've talked about the Bill of Rights. We've talked, and the 11th and 12th Amendments at the founding. We've talked about 13, 14, and 15 after the Civil War. Now let's talk about the next cluster of amendments, especially the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments. Now, you may have noticed that the amendments come in these generational spurts or clusters. There's the founding era, generating the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution and the first 10 amendments and 11 and 12, and then nothing for more than a half century, nothing after the 12th Amendment early in Jefferson's administration, nothing for a half century, then this cataclysm of Civil War and Reconstruction generating 13, 14, and 15, so the next generational spurt, then nothing again for another half century, basically. And then another generational spurt, 16, 17, and 19, most importantly. And I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture just making the case that, again, our modern world owes a great deal to the amendments, that the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments are huge features of your constitutional world today. The founders, a lot of founders said, well, the federal government won't do very much. Most of the things will be done by states. And today the federal government does lots. And some people, some of my friends in the Tea Party think that that's somehow improper, illegitimate, and not constitutional. And I say to my friends in the Tea Party, well, take another look, because it's not, the Constitution isn't just the founding. It's a series of amendments, and the amendments are nationalizing amendments after the Bill of Rights. Remember, yes, the Bill of Rights begins, Congress shall make no law of a certain sort, and ends with the 10th Amendment, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all end with the words, Congress shall have power, each one of them reflecting the nationalism of the Civil War as opposed to the localism of the Revolutionary War. So these amendments after the Civil War codify that nationalism. Congress shall have power, 13th Amendment, Section 2. Congress shall have power, 14th Amendment, Section 5. Congress shall have power, 15th Amendment, Section 2. So those amendments reflect enhanced federal power, and so do amendments 16, 17, and 19. Another thing that's happened in American history is wars, the Civil War, World War I. Wars tend to enhance the powers of the federal government vis-a-vis the states, and that's going to be a trend. Remember, in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln is trying to unify America, reunify it, not just north and south, but east and west through a transcontinental railroad. At the founding, the framers said things that are genuinely interstate, transactions that involve more than one state, that really spill over across state lines, those things the federal government can regulate, interstate commerce. But the reality at the founding is most stuff isn't interstate. Most people live and die in a 50-mile radius. You don't have a transcontinental railroad or jet travel. So much of the economy genuinely is local at the founding. Before refrigeration, you have cows everywhere because you need fresh milk. With the advent of refrigeration, you need cows just in a few places, California, Vermont, Wisconsin, a few more, and we can all drink from those cows because we've got transportation and refrigeration and communication technology, and Lincoln is a huge part of that, like with the Transcontinental Railroad. So one of the reasons we have more federal power today is that our world is genuinely more interstate and international, more connected than it was at the founding. And that's just a fact about the world that's changed. The framers said, if it's interstate, if it's international, the federal government can do it. And just a lot more stuff today is interstate and international in a world of the internet and supersonic travel and the GATT and international trade. So a lot more of the world is genuinely international. That's a fact about the world. But also the Constitution has been amended to expand federal power, not just 13, 14, and 15 on matters of race and civil rights, that the federal government will take the lead in championing voting rights, the 15th Amendment, civil rights, the 14th Amendment, and racial rights generally, all three amendments. It's not just, and human rights, not just that the federal government will have a special competence here that it didn't have before, but 16, 17, and 19 add additional federal powers and competences. At the founding, what's the federal government basically supposed to do? Interstate affairs, Western land, and foreign affairs. And raise money for. So if it's a revenue measure, the federal government can pretty much do it. If it regulates an interstate problem, the federal government that spills over across state lines, the federal government can pretty much do it. If it's a national security matter, the federal government can pretty much do it. If it's a foreign affairs matter, that's sort of the founding vision. Reconstruction adds if it's a civil rights matter, a human rights matter, a voting rights matter, the federal government can do it. Now, the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments are going to continue to broaden the scope of federal power. The 16th Amendment is going to affirm, and does, and it's adopted at the beginning of the 20th century, the power of the federal government to impose an income tax on individuals. The 17th Amendment is going to make senators directly elected by the people of each state rather than the legislature of each state. And the 19th Amendment provides for women voting equally with men. Now, my claim is you put 16 plus 17 plus 19 together, and you get the New Deal, the Great Society, Obamacare. Here's how. And when you add all that to the founding, here's how. The 16th Amendment is going to be about a power of the federal government to use its taxing power to accomplish national redistributive projects. We'll talk more about this in the next lecture, but the 16th Amendment was very much designed by people who called themselves progressives, who believed in a progressive income tax that would redistribute, that would take more, redistribute economic resources, take more from the wealthy. And you can more easily do that at the national level than at the state level, because if a state tries to do that, the rich people move out and the poor people move in. But if the federal government tries to do that, it has a lot more ability to pursue national redistributive projects. What does the 17th Amendment do? The 17th Amendment frees U.S. senators from dependence on state legislators. They're going to be more free to pursue all sorts of national projects, precisely because they're freed from dependence on state legislatures. Even if they had the power to do something under the founding regime, they might have hesitated to do it because state legislatures wouldn't like that. Well, now it doesn't matter what state legislators like. It matters what the voters want. So a modern world in which lots of senators become presidents, well, that's in part because senators are now directly elected populist politicians. That's the 17th Amendment world. The 19th Amendment, women are going to vote. Eventually, we come to see that women tend, on average, or at least have for much of the last century, to vote more for social welfare measures, for, if you're a critic of it, the nanny state, if you will. We call that in part, the gender gap. And today, more women than men are voting. And so you add the 16th Amendment, national redistributive power in the federal government, and the 17th Amendment, a Senate much more willing to vote for big federal projects, and the 19th Amendment, women voting and women voting for Social Security and daycare and education, maybe because women historically have taken care of others in their elderly parents or dependent children, maybe because women then are particularly attentive to those vulnerable members of society, maybe for other reasons. I frankly don't know why, but the data does suggest that women have, in recent eras, voted more for some of this social welfare legislation than have men. And that's a constitutional development. It's an amendment development. 16 plus 17 plus 19 is very quickly going to give you Franklin and Eleanor, 19th Amendment, and with a New Deal, and Bill and Hillary, Barack and Michelle. It's going to give you, in short, 16 plus 17 plus 19, the New Deal, the Great Society, and Obamacare. And these, I claim, are fully constitutional, not just because of the founding vision, but because the founding vision has been supplemented by the Reconstruction vision, by the Progressive Era vision. In my next lecture, we're going to walk through these amendments in a little more detail, with particular attention to the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, and the 19th Amendment, maybe the most dramatic of all, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. So stay tuned.